At the beginning, missionary radio was not seen as a tool to be used independently of traditional missionary outreach. It actually had to fight its way into acceptance with the Christian public. However, today, according to Barry Seidel, there's virtually no square foot on earth that isn't reached sometime during the day by a gospel radio broadcast.
Clarence W. Jones was the pioneer in this field. He was convinced that missions had to be in the forefront of the field of communications if the world was to be evangelized.
In 1928, he made an exploratory trip to South America, hoping to find an opening in Venezuela for radio ministry. While he was there, he was overwhelmed with the need for evangelism.
He tried to get support for his vision of missionary radio, but ended up going back to the States, where he met Reuben and Grace Larson. They were serving the Lord in Ecuador and were the key instruments in getting Jones started in the missions field. They were granted a 25-year contract for radio service, and Clarence took off for Ecuador. Despite initial difficulties, he was convinced that Quito was where the Lord wanted to use him.
Radio station HCJB, heralding Christ Jesus' blessings, started on Christmas Day in 1931 with a 250-watt transmitter being broadcast out of a sheep shed. There were only 13 receiving sets at the time, but the Voice of the Andes was on the air.
There were ups and downs, just like any practice that first starts up, but a big reason why it continued to succeed was the cooperation they had with the government of Ecuador.
They allowed the president to use the broadcasting facilities and made the program not only religious, but educational and cultural as well. Missionaries in the area were finding doors being opened because of the inclusion of the radio transmission. People were actually listening and were more open to people coming into their homes to discuss the gospel.
By the late 30s, a 10,000-watt transmitter was installed and reached out all over the Eastern Hemisphere.
In 1981, with Jones retired, HCJB celebrated its 50th anniversary. It's now grown to be more than a radio station, with the addition of hospitals, television programs, and more. Christian Airmen's Fellowship, later renamed Mission Aviation Fellowship, was founded in California in 1945. It was the first missionary aviation service organization.
It is no exaggeration to say that missionary aviation has revolutionized Christian missions in the past decade. Today, a single MAF pilot covers as much territory in a matter of weeks as David Livingstone covered in a lifetime.
Betty Green was the first full-time staff worker and the first pilot to fly for the newly formed organization. She had served in the Air Force during World War I, but her vision was mission aviation. During her time serving, she published an article in His magazine, and it was spotted by Jim Truxton, a Navy pilot. Together with two other pilots, they started their routes for MAF.
In 1945, with headquarters set up in Los Angeles, an urgent request came for assistance, and Green was the only one available. She went down to Mexico and bought a plane to service those in need. After several months, she was asked to help out in Peru, where her assignment called for flying missionaries and supplies into the interior of the country, where she became the first woman pilot to cross the peaks of the Andes. Additionally, she worked in Nigeria, East Africa, and Irian Jaya.
It was at Irian Jaya where the rigid life of a pilot started to take its toll. Having spent most of her time in the air, Green realized that it took a lot to do all the work necessary with transporting goods to and fro different places.
But this never deterred her from her vision, and the rewards were well worth the hard labor. After nearly 2 years in Irian Jaya, Green retired from active flying duty and returned to represent the mission and recruit more pilots, males in particular.
Despite her successes, she argued against placing other women as pilots because most were not trained mechanics, much of the work was heavy work, and because of the flexibility needed to be involved. Still, many women joined up because of Green's example and served the Lord faithfully.
Another notable missionary pilot is Nate Saint, who was best known for his involvement with the Auca Indians that eventually took his life.
He was an innovator himself and devised several new ideas for aviation, which included a technique involving dropping a bucket to safely deliver supplies and a harness sling for transporting larger objects. Because of his testimony and the coverage of his untimely death, his contribution to missionary aviation continues as others dedicate their lives as missionary pilots because of hearing his story.